I'm going to start recording. Okay,
Okay.
so we are starting one of the most interesting topics, which is the heart. Now, once again, like you know, we're gonna use the book and different resources from medicine itself to make sure we know the concept well. The initial concept of the heart was this red big blob, right? And now we want to move beyond that. We want to move to a point where when we talk about the heart, this is what comes in mind. Now, this looks like a difficult place. It looks very scary, and I understand that, but it's in fact very easy. So if you guys have any idea, the heart in this picture looks very uh, taunting. It's so upfront, and it's not like the heart. But let me just make it very easy for you. So like we've been talking about, red blood supplies show it's gonna come out oxygenated, and we know which part of the heart is oxygenated and which is deoxygenated. So the oxygenated part is the left part and the deoxygenated part is the right part. Initial stuff we did in O-level as well. Now we're just going to move on to the basic difficult stuff. Now in this diagram right here, so these two blobs right here, they might look like they're not the heart, but in fact they are. And these are the atria of the heart. Now you just take some time to absorb that information, okay? Because this is this part here that looks like it's sitting on top of something like that looks a little bit like a heart, because you see these muscles and you see blood supply. So these two parts are the atria, and the right is this part always when you're looking in a diagram, and left is always this part. So whenever we say right side of the heart, this is going to be the right side. And when we say left side of the heart, this is going to be the left side. It's like a mirror image of what you actually are. And it's always going to be that way, never different. So the first thing to get straight is this part, mirrored image, right side, always right side. This part, mirror image, always the left side. That's how you should look at a person from now onwards, a person, a text, an image, anything. Over here right, over here left. Now talking about the general heart, so we know the heart has chambers, and the generic name of the chambers is the atria and ventricles. It's information that we already know a little bit from O-level and prior resources, but to make it clear, this is the entire heart. These are the first vessels of the heart, just so you know. So moving towards their details. Now before actually going into the heart, I really want to make sure that everybody knows where the heart is placed. Knowing what the heart is important, but what is more important is where exactly is the heart that we're talking about. Where exactly is that in essence? And that might come up in, so this image overall is not high yield really. What really is important in this image is the fact that the heart is placed behind a big bone called the sternum. So in a question, if they tell you, they might not ask you, or they might ask you what sternum is if they really want to, but even if they don't, if they place it in a question that there's an organ behind the sternum or anything related to the sternum, you should know this bone right here is the sternum. Ribs come out of the sternum. You can see rib number 1, rib number 2, ribs coming out. Heart is placed right behind it, surrounded by the lungs. So here we have this parenchyma is that of the lungs. The dots you see, these are the lungs, right? And so is the heart situated? So now when we're talking about the heart in itself, is it situated right behind the sternum? Do you see that is it central? No, it is not. It is a little skewed towards the left side. So the heart in essence, so the heart that we're talking about here, you can see even this heart has a very conical, a very triangular shape. And that's how our heart's gonna be from now onwards. So this is exactly that heart sitting here on the diaphragm and the liver. This is the liver, this is the diaphragm. Here comes the abdominal parts that we're not going to talk about for now. This is where the heart is sitting. The heart is sitting with its apex. So if it's a triangle, the triangle has an apex and a base. So the apex of the heart is always pointing towards the left side. So if you get a blank slate of a human body, let me say this is the chest that we're talking about, and they ask you to exactly draw an X for the heart, and this is the sternum line. Where is the heart gonna be? It's gonna be somewhere over here. It's not gonna be exactly in the center. As you can see, the apex is towards the left side. I hope that is clear.
Yeah, miss.
Okay, perfect. So now moving on to the important points. So we're going to move back to the pointer. Okay, so now we talked about three muscles in our previous lecture, talking about the basic cells. The three muscles that we talked about were cardiac, smooth, and striated. So these three muscles are totally different. We initially talked about smooth and striated muscles, of how smooth muscles do not have voluntary control and striated do. In the same case here, these are the three kind of muscles in the whole of your body, right? And out of these three, only one is voluntary control. Striated is voluntary. The rest of the two are involuntary. And with involuntary, we also learn that smooth muscles do not get tired easily. They can withstand prolonged contractions without getting tired out. The cardiac muscles are exactly the same. In this topic, we're going to talk about cardiac muscle. Now, cardiac muscle isn't in much detail in your contents, but there is a little bit of significant detail, and I really wanted to talk about it to make sure you guys don't get confused. The reason for talking about it is because in the new book that I just sent you guys, cardiac muscle has been used as a keyword, and it has been used to show what the heart walls are made up of. Again, what are the heart walls? These are the heart walls. So now these striations that you see, these wall, whatever this wall is made up of, even this one, because this is the heart as well. This is the heart as well. Whatever this is made of, whatever this part, it is cardiac muscle, no other muscle. So cardiac muscle, muscle that makes up the heart. And what does it look like? So this comes right out of your book, and which is why I'm talking about this slide anyways. This comes out of your book because it's important to know the difference between cardiac, smooth, and striated muscles. Now, even if you don't know what smooth and striated muscles look like at this point, if you know what cardiac muscle looks like, that's enough. How are you going to tell them apart? The initial thing that you're going to use is knowledge that the cardiac muscle has striations. This word right here, let me show you this word, striations. And now what do striations look like? Striations are outgrowings of this cell into another. So if this is one cell, this is outgrowing into the next one. And why is that so? Because we want quick communication between one cell to another, even if it's placed parallelly. And this cell has striations through this cell. So now this movement from this cell can easily move here, and communication is very easy. So how do you tell a heart muscle? You tell it by its striations. Here you can see striating here, striating here. And then there are junctions between here, like all other cells. You can see junctions right here. This is one cardiac muscle cell. A cardiac muscle cell is called a cardiac myocyte. A muscle cell in itself is called a myocyte. We had detailed discussion already on how we have different names for cells in different places. And this discussion is going to continue with an example. That is, a cardiac myocyte is a cardiac muscle cell. And then you can see that each cell has its own nucleus. So how do you tell a cardiac muscle? You tell it's cardiac when each cell has its own nucleus, 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 and nucleus. And then it has striations with other cells within that tissue, right? That is how you tell it apart. Okay, so moving on, this is how much I want to talk about it. Moving on to now just giving you an idea, we talked about three types of muscles. So here it is, skeletal muscles in your arms, your biceps and triceps, smooth muscle. We've already talked about them yesterday as well. They're there in different organs. They're there in your vasculature. And then finally, cardiac muscles in the heart. Cardiac muscles, as you can see, each cell has a nucleus and then striations. Here you can see, look at this cell having a striation with this cell. Can you see striations anywhere else? No. So this is the only type of muscle that will have striations. All of these fibers are lying parallel. Other small differences do exist, but one of the most important difference, striations. Here's another example. This is again a histological slide, and you can see, look at this muscle. Look at this tiny striation going here. Look at this huge striation going here. You can tell each one of those cells have their own nucleus, And you can see striations, and then you can also see these interconnections over here. So this is the cardiac myocyte. Any questions on this slide?
No, miss. It's
So I
clear.
hope you understand this concept. And if any question comes up, this is more than enough to answer those questions. Okay, now moving towards the heart, the anatomy, the problem, the entire thing we're here for. So the heart, like we talked about, is divided into right and left, and it has a septum between it. This septum divides the right and the left. Now, right now, this is a very simplistic diagram. So we're going to stick towards my pointer. Wherever this right pointer goes, that's the part we're talking about. Let's start with the right atrium. The right atrium receives blood from the rest of the body. The right atrium receives blood from the rest of the body. The vessel that carries blood towards the heart is always a vein. So anything that's moving blood towards the heart is a vein. Vein here, vein here. Doesn't matter if it's oxygenated or deoxygenated blood, it's gonna be a vein if it's going towards the heart. So now we have a vessel bringing in blood towards the right atrium. What do we call it? It's called a vena cava. The vena cava is a lot of veins joining together to form a huge vein that brings blood towards the right atrium. The atrium, let me tell you here, are also called the auricles. So these are alternating words if they come up in a question. Now from the right atrium, the blood cannot, so there's an intermuscular septum between the right and left side. Blood cannot flow anywhere else. And there's also septums that separate the upper right side and the lower right side. The upper right side is the atrium and the lower one is the ventricle. And the only slit to pass from the right atrium, the upper side, to the lower side, the right ventricle, is this small opening. And this small opening is guarded by a valve to prevent backflow of blood from the ventricle to the atrium. And this valve is called the mitral valve, or the tricuspid valve. And now we're also going to learn why we call it the tricuspid valve. Let me just throw in a little bit of it here for you. It's called tricuspid because it has 3 cusps. And now we're gonna, so let's stop this information here. Just retain the name and we can talk about why it's called this later in a later slide. So we know there's a vena cava going to the right atrium. Blood is going from the right atrium to the right ventricle. And on the way in middle there's a valve called the tricuspid or mitral valve that will prevent backflow from the right ventricle to the right atrium. And then from the right ventricle, we need the blood to move towards the lungs, just how we talked about in our first lecture. And for that blood to flow through to the lungs, there's another opening into a large vessel. And that vessel is the pulmonary artery. That large vessel is the pulmonary artery. And then there's, again, every opening is going to have a valve in the heart. And the valve of this opening is called the semilunar valve. And we've already talked about why it's called the pulmonary artery, because pulmo is lungs. And we know from COVID that when we go to a pulmonologist, we're going to be treating our lungs. So any vessel of the lungs is called the pulmonary vessel. And this one specifically going from the right ventricle away from the heart is an artery. So this one's a pulmonary artery. And now the blood, the deoxygenated blue blood from the lungs is going to come back to the left atrium via a vein. And that vein is the pulmonary vein because the lungs is the pulmo. And this is coming back to the left atrium. And so from the left atrium, blood's going to pass back to the left ventricle, again down below. And since there's a slit, there's also going to be a valve here. This valve is a bicuspid valve. This valve was a tricuspid valve. Now just retain the words for now. The right side is going to have tricuspid and the left side is going to have bicuspid. And again, from the ventricle, we have blood going to the body like we talked about. Blood leaving the ventricle Going to the body, goes through the aorta, biggest artery in the body, the aorta. And then again, there's an opening, so there's a valve, and the valve here is the semilunar valve. So any valve within the heart is either the tricuspid valve or the bicuspid valve, and any valve from an artery or a vessel leaving the body is always a semilunar valve. Very simplistic. Just one more tip to remember that the tricuspid is always towards the right atrium. R in right atrium, R in tricuspid. Okay, so we have that's like a hint to know that this is tricuspid, so we don't confuse both of them. Okay, so I hope you guys have retained these words by now. If not, I'll give you 3 seconds to look through the slides and then we can move on. Okay,
Yes, that's clear.
okay, great. Okay, now again, another image from the heart, very easy stuff. Look at this one, look at this. This is the right atrium. The upper half, this is the interventricular septum, which means between the two ventricles, we have a septum. Between the two sides of the hearts, we have a septum. This is the right side, the left side. Once again, now the upper part is quite smaller. It's called the atrium, and the larger, bigger part is called the ventricle. The ventricles have very thick walls. You can see here, look at these walls, look at these thick walls. And why do these have thick walls? Because blood from the atrium is just going to push a little bit and enter down here, but blood from here is supposed to go to the entire body or the entire lungs. So we need much more thicker walls to push it through. And now, very easy stuff. From the vena cava, blood comes from the body, enters the atrium, passes through in the ventricle. Between both of them, there's one prominent structure, the valve. And what valve is that? You can call it an atrioventricular valve or a tricuspid valve. A tricuspid valve. And now the blood is going to move up. And so see, why is there a valve? When the muscle from this area contracts, blood can either move up here or here. When it moves up here, it fills the cusps. These flaps of the valve are called cusps. It's going to fill these flaps and close them. And then it's only going to have one direction to flow into, which is this vessel right here. And how do you know you've entered a vessel? So this is still the ventricle. This is still the ventricle, still the ventricle. As soon as you cross this cusp, you see the cusps again? Quite similar. Cusps of the semilunar valves. As soon as you cross these, you're out. Where are you going to go? You're going towards the pulmonary artery. This artery is the pulmonary artery. And so from the right ventricle, you're going right to the pulmonary artery. Here, you're getting oxygenated in the lungs, coming back through the pulmonary veins into the left atrium. Again, this is you're crossing these cusps. These cusps are from the bicuspid valve, and here in the left ventricle. And then you're moving up again into the aorta, which is right here, and into the body. And so these big areas are the ventricles, and the smaller ones are the atria. And so now let's just talk a little bit about the valves again. So these valves have cusps, like I just told you. Here's these cusps. Valves that have 3 cusps are called tricuspid, and valves that have 2 cusps will be called bicuspid. So that tells us the right atrium has a lot more cusps. And if you technically think about it, it is important because the right atrium receives blood from all of your body, and that's going to be a lot of blood dumping into the right ventricle. And that's much more blood that's coming from the lungs. So this side needs to push a lot of blood, and it needs 3 very strong cusps just to make sure none of the blood slips back into towards the back side of the body. I hope that's clear.
Yep.
Okay, so this was the structure of the heart. Any questions about it?
No, miss.
Okay, are the words really difficult? Do we need to talk more about the words to reiterate them, or are they fine at this point? You know what is what?
Yeah, miss, it's fine.
Okay, perfect. Now, again, another illustration just showing vessels and how blood travels. The blue side is used to show you how, see, this is the vena cava. Now, when we're talking about blood coming in, you can see this, there are two vena cava, an inferior one and a superior one. This is the atrium. Here it comes in to the wall, crossing to the ventricle, moving again to, now look at this. This is a huge pulmonary artery trunk dividing into four smaller pulmonary arteries in the lung, coming back via these, look at these openings, coming back via these openings, and which are the pulmonary vein, into the left atrium, moving through towards the left ventricle, and then finally, look at this. This is the trunk of aorta. This is the trunk through which it's gonna move down and then further up into the head, further down into the abdomen, the viscera, and the legs and everything. So very clear image, not difficult. If you still need to understand this image, point it out at any point and we can come back to this. Again, very easy. Just look at the openings. Where are they opening? If it's opening here, it's the vena cava. If it's opening here, it's the pulmonary. It is the pulmonary vein. If it's opening anywhere else, you can easily tell. Now, this image comes directly from your book because I want to make sure that when you go back to reading your book, you know what you're reading. Again, an image from the book, you can see that they've chosen a similar heart. Mine was quite tough, which is, it's more medical heart. This is relatively easier, but that's going to help you keep in mind what an exact heart looks like. So very easy stuff. We've talked about this already. We have a right atrium sitting right here. Blood's gonna go from here to the ventricle, which is here. One ventricle's here, the other one's here. Look at this one. There's this blood supply to the heart that we're gonna talk about soon. Vessels leaving and entering the heart, and then there's one arched vessel. What is this arched vessel called? It's the aorta. Always remember this arched vessel, aorta, a vessel that is not arched but leading right next to it from the ventricle. It's always the pulmonary artery. This is the pulmonary trunk. This is the aorta. So yeah, that's basically it. You can see the two vena cava, the superior one and the inferior one, and you can see different arteries. This is the pulmonary arteries. So very easy stuff. Go back to the book. If you still don't get it, we can discuss it again. Again, now we're going to talk about these vessels. So in the heart, we have the heart that has vessels supplying rest of the body. But branching from the aorta itself, aorta, which supplies all of the body, also supplies the heart itself. Look at this. It's branching from the aorta to supply the heart itself. And these vessels supplying the heart are called the coronary arteries. Right here in your keywords, the coronary arteries. Arteries that branch from the aorta. Very important point. A lot of students get confused because they don't know where they're coming from. They know what the coronary arteries are. They don't know where they're coming from. So I'm just going to draw it out here. So everybody knows where we're coming from. Here we are coming from the aorta. This is the aorta. Coming from this one's going to be coming from the other side of the aorta. Let me complete it for completion's sake. This one's coming from here, right? So both of them coming from the aorta. And then we have these and over the walls of the heart supplying the cardiac muscle with obviously nutrients and oxygen. And then we have the septum, the layer of tissue that separates the left and right sides of the heart, just like we talked about. We have the atria, one of the chambers of the heart that receives low pressure blood from the veins. And it says veins here because all of the blood coming towards the heart is always the veins. We have the ventricles, one of the chambers of the heart that receives blood from the atria and then pushes it into the arteries. You don't have to cram this stuff if you know what's happening. You just have to put your information together and you're good to go. The atrioventricular valve, a valve between the atria and ventricles, that closes when the ventricles contract. Okay, important stuff right here. What we talked about. Ventricles contract, blood flows back up towards the arteries. If this area contracts, it's going to move here and here. What's keeping it from moving here and keep stopping it from moving here? The AV valve, the atrioventricular valve. Which one is over this side? It's the right side, so tricuspid valve. Then the bicuspid valve and the tricuspid valve. Very easy stuff. I hope it's clear. So when you go back to your book,
Yes.
you're gonna know these words. You're just gonna have to read through them. You don't have to cram them again. So very easy stuff again. From the aorta, we have two vessels coming off, the coronary arteries. Supplying the right side is the right coronary artery, and supplying the left side is the left coronary artery. That's all you're supposed to know on this slide. Moving on, we're going to talk about the valves. We've already talked about it. Tricuspid has three cusps. You can see these cusps here. Look at these cusps, three cusps. Mitral, it has two cusps. Look at these cusps here. Look at these cusps. Okay, now we're going to talk about what is the internal structure of it. Just because there's one diagram in your book that has the internal structure, I want to make sure you know. So these are the cusps of the valve, and these cusps are held by tendinous cords called chordae tendineae to muscles. These, apart from the heart muscles or cardiac myocytes, there's also a bunch of muscle here, these ridges, which are muscles that hold these cusps of the valves through these tendons, and these muscles are very important in making sure that the valves don't flip over to the other side. If they make sure that the valve remain towards this side, you can see them here as well. Look at these valves. Two side bicuspid, tricuspid, three valves. You can also see the semilunar valves here. So these are the semilunar valves. These here are the two valves we were talking about. And here we have tendons of the valve cusps of the valve, and the muscles of the valves. Very easy. Here you go. Real human heart image. These are the valves. Look at the tendons of the valves holding them together, known as the chordae tendineae. Look at these cusps again. Blood, why do we need these muscles? And these muscles are called the papillary muscles. Why do we need these muscles? To make sure that the valves, when the blood is pushing against them, they're still held towards this side. They don't flip over to the other side and, move into the atrium. They make sure that they are still placed facing the ventricles. And this discussion was important because there's a figure in your book, the new version of the book, which talks about the atrium, the wall of the ventricle. So this is basically, imagine the heart laying down on its side and you're cutting from the ventricle. You're looking in from the ventricle, from where you see that the other end is the atria. And here you see the papillary muscles that we just talked about, connected to tendons, chordae tendineae, connected to cusps of the valves. So this is why we had the previous slides, because there is this one image in your book, the updated book, that I feel is very important. And because it's a new image, there's a highly likely chance this is going to come up. So this is all about the valves, talking about how blood comes in, and then we'll move this discussion further towards the heartbeat cycle. So the blood comes in, atria, deoxygenated blood and oxygenated blood at the same time. The atria contract, pushing blood into the ventricles. The ventricles contract to push blood out into the body. And just one more point here, like we already talked about, more blood comes in towards the right side. So the right side has a less thicker wall and a relatively larger lumen to make sure more blood comes in here. And also because it has only to pump blood to the lungs, which are a closer distance, as compared to the left side, which has a much more thicker wall to pump blood, like we talked about in the last lecture, at a 120 millimeter of mercury pressure into the aorta. So this is why the left side is going to have a much thicker muscular valve. This is about the side. Now we're going to move on to how the cycle works. So that was one image. This is the image from your book. We're going to look at the key words. So let me just point them out to you at this point. Contraction is always called a systole. And a dilation or a rest period is always called a diastole. And if you know these words and you can correlate them with what's happening, you know what's written in the cardiac cycle. It's very simple. Blood's gonna pool into the atria as the atria are resting. There's gonna be an atrial systole as atria contract, pushing blood into the ventricle. And in the meanwhile, when the ventricles are filling, this is called as a ventricular diastole, just like we talked about. Resting or dilation is diastole, and when the ventricles contract, it's called a ventricular systole, in which the blood moves out. Now, the diastole basically is generally used in the third cycle. So if we say this is the first cycle where an atrial systole is taking place and blood is moving to the next chamber, and then there's a ventricular systole, and then this is pooling, and then there's a ventricular systole, blood moving out. The diastole generally is called right after both of these systole phases, where the entire heart is just resting and there's no blood pooling in. And it's a very short period right after which blood comes in and fills the atria. Okay, so here in your book, atrial systole, just like we talked about, as the atria contract, filling the ventricles, backflow is prevented by the valves, just like we talked about. When the ventricular systoles occur, backflow is being prevented again by valves as blood moves up, and then eventually both of these will relax as blood is going to pool in into both the systems, more into the atria than into the ventricles. It's going to be pooling in from the body, and this is known as the ventricular diastole, where both atrias and ventricles relax. So when both of them are relaxing, we call it a diastolic state. Okay, so I hope that is clear. That is the entirety of the cardiac cycle. Very easy. I hope you're not confused at any point.
Yeah, miss, it's clear.
Okay, now looking at the cardiac cycle in terms of pressures that occur in the cycle. Now, this is very important stuff. We need to pay close attention to it. So in this, we need to know what each line represents. Now, for the first thing that we also talked about the other day is to know that the systemic circuit, or the circuit moving from the left side of the heart, is always going to be at a higher pressure. And the pulmonary circuit is going to be at a lower pressure. So if you know these two things, you're going to know that the highest pressure is building up in the aorta. And then after the aorta, it's building up in the left side of the body. So this represents the left ventricle's pressure. And then eventually the lower pressure, that means is obviously towards in the atria, because they are smaller, the muscles are less in quantity, right? And then we have to talk about diastoles and systoles on this graph. So on the cardiac cycle graph, where do you think we're going to have a systole? We're going to have a systole whenever pressures are really rising. That's the easiest key. When the pressures are really rising, when do you see the pressures really rising? Right here. Both pressures climb. Look at this. This pressure green one climbs, the red one also climbs, what this means basically is that this is a systole. And as the systole ends, the pressures are definitely going to have fallen a lot more, right? And we're going to enter a diastole, which means a relaxation phase. So one thing we need to get clear is that this huge rise is due to a systole. The rise in pressure is because we are making the muscle contract, not we consciously, but involuntary contractions that put in a lot of pressure. So then what is this small peak? Now see, one cycle ends here, and this one is the same cycle being repeated. So not to get confused, the cycle's ending here. This is the first cycle, and this is the second cycle. So what is this peak? This peak is the little bit of pressure that rises as the atria get filled. So let's have that clear in our mind. And we have the labeling, so in case anybody can't read them, This is the pressure in the aorta. We've already talked about how it reaches 120. Aorta is the only pressure, and obviously the ventricle, the left ventricle. But since we're talking about both ventricles together, the green line is the pressure in the ventricle, and then the atria definitely has much lesser pressure because of the lesser muscles, the lesser size, and that it only has to push a little bit of blood into the ventricles. So here, this small rise is the diastolic phase that we talked about here. Look at this diastole. Blood was filling in. This filling in of blood makes the pressure rise a little bit, and then it falls back. Why does it fall back? Because now the heart is going to contract very strongly and move this blood into the aorta. So the aortic pressure that was falling from the previous cycle is now going to rise again and reach its maximum of 120. And when the diastole ends, the pressure falls again, very slowly in the aorta, because like we talked about when we were discussing the aortic vessel, that it has muscular walls, pulsatile movements, elastin in its walls, but the heart is just going to go into a diastole phase and relax and let the pressure down for more blood here to build up. So in this diagram, I hope you understand the pressures. If you understand the pressures, the systole and the diastole, it's very easy to tell which valve closes when and opens when. After a diastole, when we have a systole, pressure in the ventricle, as soon as this pressure rises, the atrioventricular valve is going to close. So whether it's the mitral valve or the tricuspid valve, bicuspid valve, whatever valve it is, it's gonna close here because the ventricular pressure is rising. We don't want blood to go back into the aorta. And then what's gonna happen here? The aortic valve's going to open. And when this valve opens, blood pressure rises in the aorta because blood moves into the aorta. And when this valve closes, when does this valve close? This valve closes when the blood, as soon as blood starts falling, because you don't want blood moving back into the ventricle. And when this ventricular pressure is very low, lower than the atrial pressure, where these two curves meet, wherever curves will meet, we have the valves opening and closing. So now the ventricular pressure is very low. Now there's no blood moving in or out, so the mitral valve can open, right? So it's very easy. Look at the graph, look at where the lines are intersecting, look at whether it's a systole or a diastole, and you can just make a guess where which valve's gonna close and where which one's gonna open. Just a key point here. We know we use a stethoscope to auscultate, and we have two signs in auscultation. We have the lub sound and the dub sound, you know, the lub dub, lub dub. The lub sound is the louder sound when the mitral valve closes. So here it's pointed out that this is the sound of the lub when the bigger valve is closing, and the smaller sound when this smaller semilunar valve is closing. So any questions on the cardiac cycle?
No, miss.
Is it clear? If I take out these labels and I just ask you which valve's closing here, will you be able to tell me?
Yep.
Because it's very easy. Just imagine a systole. Just imagine the changes in pressure. Just imagine how pressure is rising and pressure is falling. If we're talking about the semilunar valve, again, imagine the aorta opening. Obviously, whatever semilunar valves are placed there, they'll open. So cardiac cycle, this one's right out of your book. Again, you're going to have these pressures labeled. So your book, interestingly, does not have the other labels of when the valves are opening and closing, but I clearly remember there being questions about the opening and closing of valves. So go back to your book, label these, and check them if you've labeled them correctly, and that's your homework revision. Again, we're talking about valves as your book has described them. So you can see the book has talked about these cusps. The book has talked about these muscles. Why are we talking about these muscles? Because these papillary muscles are different from the cardiac myocytes. And then again, about the tendons. And then your book also talks about the atrial systole, the ventricular systole, and the diastole. Not very difficult keywords are there. And I hope after this lecture, reading through the book will be a breeze. Okay, now the last topic, which is the heartbeat. For the heartbeat, so it's very easy, just two important concepts to know here. First thing is you need to know that the atria will contract before the ventricles. The first thing we need to know, atria will contract before the ventricles always, never together. And then the second thing is the cardiac myocytes. Even if your brain's dying and your heart's alive, in a heart transplant, if you place the heart outside, the heart will continue to beat because the beating of the heart is myogenic. And what do I mean by myogenic? So myocyte and myogenic. Myogenic means the beating initiates from the heart itself. It is internally beating. The muscles themselves are beating. There is no neural input, no input from your brain, from your neurons. There is control from your brain that we're going to talk about, not here, but very later on, maybe in your, after your A-levels sometimes, if you still choose to stick to bio, but not right now. So thank God, few, but the important stuff in a heartbeat is that the heartbeat is myogenic. It's going to start itself and end itself. So when we talk about it being myogenic and that the muscles and the cells themselves have the potential to start and end it, then and let me tell you this, each cell, so the movement of a muscle is always just depolarization, right? The muscle is just going to depolarize, if you remember from O levels, and then continue movement, contract, right? And the depolarization here in this muscle, so let me tell you this, each muscle in the heart is randomly depolarizing at all times in your life. It's just randomly depolarizing. So what's important to know here is that the muscles of the heart, as they are depolarizing, there is one specific muscle that depolarizes before all muscles and leads to an action potential being generated. It depolarizes, and because we know these are striated, if one of them is contracting, it's going to pull, it's going to send signal to all of the other, and so it's going to control all of the other, and before anyone else depolarizes, it's going to depolarize the heart to its own rate. And that rate, my friends, is your heart rate. The heart rate between 60 to 100 is in fact that one myocyte depolarizing. And what's that one myocyte? That one myocyte is the sinus node or sinoatrial node. It is this one right here. This one right here, also known as the pacemaker. Also, why is it known as the pacemaker? Because it decides the pace at which the entire cells of the heart are going to depolarize and start contractions. So how does it work? This is all electrical impulses generating onto themselves, forcing other cells to regulate with them. So the sinoatrial node placed right here is going to depolarize, and it's going to make the entire atria depolarize as well. The atria will start depolarizing and then they will contract. This contraction cannot cross over to the ventricle. It can only cross over when it reaches the atrioventricular node. So the second signal to depolarize comes from the AV node. The first signal, the SA node, the sinoatrial node. The second signal, the atrioventricular node. And then eventually this node is not just going to haphazardly pass all of its signal to the ventricle. No, my friends, it's going to pass its signal to the bundle of His, which are in the intraventricular septum. And in this septum, contraction is first going to move towards the apex. So the heart starts beating, not irregularly, but from the apex, it beats towards the upper muscles. And as it beats upwards, it's going to push this blood out. Imagine this area reaching, having signal first. What's going to happen? Blood's going to move down. The heart instead sends signal from the SA node to the AV node to the bundle of His, that sends signals to the interventricular septum. These fibers are also called the bundle of His. This is going to move towards the apex of the heart. From the apex, there are fibers moving upwards, not downwards, upwards to in the walls of the ventricles towards both sides. These fibers are known as the Purkinje fibers. And these are going to make the heart move and beat upwards. Okay, so I hope that much is clear. These are simplistic diagrams explaining stuff. So this is again sinoatrial node moving toward depolarizing the atria first, then all the signals gathering at the atrioventricular node, not just moving down itself, it's going to be at the AV node, from the AV node into the bundle of His, that's going to move to the apex, making the apex contract, and these contractions then move through the Purkinje fiber towards the upper side of the ventricles, so that the movement of contraction is first moving down here to make sure blood pools here, and then the movement of blood upwards is always contraction from the apex first, then the sides, so that blood can move upwards. And that is the heartbeat. This is a cycle, very easily explaining the same stuff. Contraction, look at the yellow contraction, first in the atria, never moving down alone. Why? Because there's the movement the movement of signal can only move down if all of it reaches the AV node and moves down the bundle of His, first going to the apex, then moving to the sides through the Purkinje fibers, making the heart beat how it does usually. The atria first, the apex second, and the rest of the walls third. I hope this is clear.
Yes.
The only words you need to learn: SA node, AV node, and then bundle of His in the interventricular septum to the apex. From the apex, the Purkinje fibers or Purkinje fibers, different names, but just so you know, ignore these, just know how the yellow part is moving. So again, keywords: myogenic, we've already talked about, sinoatrial, right from your book, the AV node, the Purkinje or the Purkinje tissue, Purkinje or Purkinje, whatever word you like to use. It can alternatively come in the exam. So just one question: where is the mammalian heartbeat initiated? Anybody can answer that for me?
AV.
Oh, no, my friend. It's going to be initiated in this node right here. The first one is always the pacemaker, is always the sinoatrial node.
Oh, my
The
bad.
AV node, let
Sorry.
me tell you, the AV node is there to make sure that that until or unless all of the atria have contracted, no signal moves down here. The AV node is like a gate. It's a gate to regulate the fact that all of the atria have contracted, only then will the AV node depolarize and lead to the depolarization of the bundle of His and the Purkinje fibers. Is that clear?
Okay.
So when we're talking about the heart being being initiated, it's always the sinoatrial node, the pacemaker. And when we're talking about the AV node, it's just a patch of tissue in the septum of the heart, which transmits the wave of excitation from walls of the atria to the Purkinje tissue. And where's the Purkinje tissue? It's basically from the base of the ventricles to all of their walls. And the connection between the AV to the Purkinje tissue is always the bundle of His. Right here in the center, the bundle of His ensures that the contraction goes to the apex first and not to the walls first. Okay?
All right.
Yeah, so please don't confuse these if you still do. And when we do the practice tests for these, we're going to talk about this further if you're still confused. Okay, so what causes the bicuspid valve to close during a ventricular systole? Very easy answer if you understand this diagram well. There's a ventricular systole and this one. So here's the bicuspid valve in the right, on the right side. If this area is contracting and the pressure here is rising, only then will these valves close, right?
Yeah.
So very easy answer. Let's see. Let's read all of the options to make sure. A greater blood pressure in the left atrium than in the ventricle? No, I mean, that's the natural physiology. If the pressure here is high, it's good for us because then blood will move down, right? Not the right answer. A greater blood pressure in the left ventricle than in the left atrium? So that makes sense, right? Because there's a higher pressure here, and this pressure can lead to blood moving backwards because this is contracting, and then that can lead to backflow. And what prevents backflow? The bicuspid valve, right? So that's our answer right there. For completion's
Right, miss.
sake, let's do the last two options as well. Contraction of muscles in the septum. So not really, because we know that the real contraction comes from the apex and the valves, right? And contraction of muscles in the valve. Now, this is why you need to know the muscles of this muscle, this one little ridge, which is the pupillary sphincter muscle, the pupillary muscle. Because look at this here, contraction of muscle in the valve. No, not at all, because this muscle, the only function of this is to hold this valve tight when blood is backflowing and prevent it from flipping over. Okay, so that's our two questions. Right out of the book again. And that's it. That is how we are going to end this. That is heart biology for you. Are there any other questions?
No, miss.
So I hope this topic is clear.
Yep.
Great. If there are no questions, we can end the call.
All right, miss.
I hope you understood today's lecture. Let me just end recording.